All right. Next, I would like to introduce our speaker, Angela Keller-Herzog, who will be giving this evening's talk on climate change in Ottawa and community action. Angela is the founding executive director of Community Associations for Environmental Sustainability, an organization called Cafés for short. And she served as its co-chair from 2015 to 2020. She's active in the Ottawa community as an environmental and social justice advocate and an active citizen observer of municipal affairs, serving as a director on the boards of the Glebe Community Association and formerly the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op and Co-Energy Ontario Co-op. She is a co-founder of Ottawa Centre Refugee Action and also leads Horizon Green, a small economic consultancy firm. Angela is a trained economist and has over 2 decades of experience in consulting, program management, policy development, risk management, and has done 2 decades of service in international development with the Canadian International Development Agency. Angela, welcome to Environmental Cafe 613. We're looking forward to your talk this evening.
Thank you very much, Sherry. I think that I should try to simplify my biography to be less complicated. So thank you all for welcoming me to your session. And I'm going to try to figure out how to share the right screen. Share, and then hopefully that will work. And then I'm going to click on that thing, and now it's even better, right? Okay, great. I see some nods. So I have been told by your August organizers that we have quite a lot of time, so that I can go on with my very interesting presentation for maybe around 20 minutes is what I'm going to aim at. And then hopefully that will leave us lots and lots of time for questions, which I find is the most interesting part. Now, your organizers posed certain questions for me that I'm going to seek to answer in my presentation. And that was interesting for me too. And I definitely ended up making some new slides that will hopefully be useful for some time into the future. So let's get going here. So the overview of the presentation, I'm going to start getting us going by an intro in terms of what does climate action look like in Ottawa, and then how does the Cafés network work? And that was actually, I've done lots of sort of intros, here's Cafés, but the question was, how does it work? So I thought that was a good question. And then I'm going to give you a municipal climate update. Some things that for municipal watchers with a climate lens that have been happening in just the last few months. And I'm going to be polling you after the presentation. I'm going to highlight 4 different things, and I'm going to ask you whether you knew that stuff already or whether this is just new. And I'm assuming that most of you are based in Ottawa, and that most of you take an interest in environment stuff. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here this evening, I imagine. And then I'm going to just quickly touch on the climate resiliency workshops, which is something that Cafés ran earlier this year. And then we'll get to the interesting questions. So there we go. So what does climate action look like in Ottawa? So we've had our share of rallies and marches for climate. Parliament Hill, of course, a favorite venue. These things ebb and flow, and we definitely, I think, had the highest attendance for the climate march in 2019 when Greta Thunberg was in Ottawa. But climate action is not just about rallies. It can also be about community activities, about tree planting, about renewable energy, pollinator plants, shifting our diets to be less meat-based and possibly also more healthy at the same time. So these can all be climate actions. Climate action can also be political participation, taking an interest in our public affairs and challenging our local leaders. So this is a shot of our city hall here in Ottawa. And climate action can also look like this, which is a group of citizens deliberating on what their concerns are in terms of climate risks and what could be some of the community solutions. So that's a shot for one of the workshops that we ran earlier this year. So all of it is what climate action looks like. We have individual action. We have, I think, very importantly, we should be thinking about what are the collective actions that we can take here in Ottawa. Greta Thunberg talks about systems change. We can think about public investments and incentives. We can think about regulatory action. And of course, calls for change and advocacy are part of it. And all of this, I would argue, is requires community. It's pretty much impossible for one person alone to make that much change. We definitely need to work together on this. So what is the Café's network all about then? I'm happy to tell you that we've existed for a bit now. We were founded in 2010. And we're a network of local and neighborhood environmental leaders and community builders. I imagine people just like you here in this call. So our members include representatives from urban, suburban, and rural communities. Cafés definitely did start as an urban association, but is very intent on balancing out and gaining membership in the other parts of our city. And at this point, I think actually this slide is slightly outdated. I think we're about 200 individual and organizational representatives from probably maybe 21 wards and yes, over 50 neighborhoods. So a good size network. Our mission and vision is to advocate for environmental sustainability, to promote climate action and leadership, and to create a healthy, green, inclusive, and livable city. So probably that's not that surprising. And our mandate tries to support and promote very local neighborhood actions and initiatives, and then to be an effective advocacy network and to build community. Again, this idea that connecting individuals to work together is how we can move forward. We have been focusing our activities mostly in, I would say, 3 thematic areas, although they're broadly defined. So it's possible to connect all kinds of things. So, and for each of these thematic areas, we have what we call a caucus, which is essentially a meeting that we convene periodically to connect people that are doing local projects in these areas, that want to talk to each other, that have maybe issues, that maybe they want allies to defend a certain forest or piece of nature, or maybe they want to build support for a particular policy idea. So the thematic areas are trees and green space, the climate caucus, and then the third one is maybe not as well established. It's the waste and circular economy caucus, and arguably part of the way for the future will have to depend on us shifting to a more circular economy. So that can be quite a big concept. So this is my new slide. that tries to explain to you how cafes actually works. So we're a network. We have a board of directors that try to provide like strategic direction and oversight. Part of that also is the financial oversight. The executive director, that would be me. Then there's people leading projects, and they can be also volunteers. And currently I have 2 staff. The reason we can have staff is that the federal government offers some wage subsidies for young people. Hopefully that will continue. Then in terms of the cafes network, and this is the other parts here, we have organizational members, and the organizational members actually very recently met, and we had a combination strategic meeting and social meeting, and that was, it's kind of nice for me to be executive director. There's certain things that I do have power over, so that combination of using our minds and then also using our hearts and the social gathering, I thought was a really nice combination, and in a sense that also I think reflects part of the spirit of cafes, because there is a sense of also the social connection in a network of humans, right? So our individual members then, as the previous slide already revealed, meet in the thematic caucus meetings. And then also, I think we've been building a lot of this in this year. We have quite a few working groups where, for example, we have a climate misinformation working group, which sprang up in reaction to quite a bit of climate misinformation and climate denial being spouted at the City Environment Committee. We have a renewable energy working group that is concerned about the energy transition materializing here in Ottawa. There's a group of people looking at the trees and the new zoning bylaw and how that works together. That's actually more of a staff driven idea, and then we've collected a number of people who are very savvy on planning and zoning. Cafes also has excellent relationships with other organizations, including the FCA, which is the Federation of Citizens Associations. So we work on a lot of things in partnership. We're also working on a white paper on collective climate action, and there's a peer review group for that. And then the newest group that's just getting started is a community writers network, where we're ambitioning to raise awareness and knowledge about various environmental issues through writing about them in the community newspapers. And some also possibly some online. So there's a few community outlets that have moved to online, so we're thinking of also going there. And what we want to do is create a network where people can offer peer support, they can bounce ideas around, they can share sources. And a lot of the community newspapers, they really like local writers, but they don't mind if you're taking someone else's article and you're adapting it, adding things to it, giving it the local color and the local flavor for your neighborhood. So that's the idea of this new community writers network that is just forming. So, and I think that sometimes the caucus meetings, that would be like 30, 40 people. So that's excellent, right? To share information when these people are coming from all across the city. But for the working groups, they tend to be smaller, right? That's more practical. So that's how our functioning looks like. And I guess what I didn't put on the slide is that we also do workshops and events, and that we also have an annual general meeting where everybody comes together. And yeah, but that would have been too much content. There's already a lot of stuff on this slide. So Okay, so that was the end of how does cafes work and what is cafes all about. Again, I'm very happy to answer questions if you have some about that later. So now what I'm going to do is give you the municipal climate update. And I'm going to walk you through 4 things that have happened in the last couple of months. And I would be very interested to know at the end of the presentation how many of you knew all this stuff already, or how many people found this to be new information. So very recently on December 6th, the municipal budget was passed. And so the question is, well, what does the municipal budget look like with a climate lens? And I would say that there are a number of areas that are high impact spending. And I would define that as emission reduction, sort of bang for the buck, plus also co-benefits, right? Where we're spending for maybe more than one purpose. And there definitely are some sweet spots there. Public transit is one, and the budget we just passed had $180 million on spending on the new electric buses. So that's quite a big sweet spot spend. That we would definitely applaud. And a lot of the affordable housing, where the municipality is saying we're going to commit more money to build affordable housing here in Ottawa, because a lot of that money, I think, is going to the not-for-profit sector. They tend to build, operate, rather than just like build and like sell. So the building standards in terms of energy efficiency and carbon efficiency by people that build, operate, tend to be much higher than by the developers that just build and try to sell at lowest cost. So we're also quite optimistic about the discretionary parts of the budget that we saw on affordable housing. There's also $5 million in the capital budget for the climate master plan implementation. And what was very interesting about that is that when it came to committee and then also to council, there was a motion by Councillor Hill from Barrhaven, who basically kind of piggybacked what I would call a policy motion on this budget section of the budget, basically seeking to prioritize the spending, flipping it from attention to climate mitigation and the emissions to adaptation, to resiliency actions, and also saying that the city as a corporation, okay, fine for the city to take care of its buildings and so forth, but it doesn't have business in terms of climate action in the community. That should be the federal government. So, and that is maybe not the view of everybody in communities that would like to see the city work with us to reduce our emissions and to create a city where it's possible to live with a lower carbon footprint and still have a convenient life. So that motion and that tussle was quite a bit debated, and not so much in terms of wordsmithing it, but in terms of even determining what it meant and how it was to be interpreted. And we'll continue to see the impact of that because Councillor Hale has now forced staff to prioritize and provide a spending plan. And so that debate on whether we want a climate action plan that has a balance between mitigation and adaptation, or whether we're starting to shift towards adaptation, is something happening here in Ottawa. And then Café's recommendations into the municipal budget also included that we should look at areas of savings where it would be saving the city money by spending less on urban expansion, on urban sprawl. We should have a carbon lens on capital projects, try to not invest in more fossil fuel infrastructure, and also find linkages in green infrastructure in stormwater management. I'll come back to that again later. But some of the nature-based solutions can be much cheaper than the engineering gray infrastructure solutions. And we also recommended that we should spend on climate risk mitigation, reallocating money from reserves, and also increase the budget for forestry. So that was a bit of a look at the budget. Switching to my second topic, I don't know how many of you knew that there is an active pipeline debate here in Ottawa, where there's a thing called the St. Laurent pipeline, which cuts right through Ottawa and actually goes over to Quebec. And the Enbridge, our natural gas company, put in an application for the replacement of this pipeline to the Ontario Energy Board, which is the regulator of this utility, which has its monopoly, right? And the regulator, the OEB, said, well, no, we don't think so. We don't think this pipeline needs to be replaced. You can just like maintain it, monitor it better, like fix it up here and there. That is the more cost-effective and reasonable strategy. And we are expecting the demand for natural gas to be declining as we're transitioning away from fossil fuel. And this was shocking. It was definitely one of the first times that the regulator did not agree with the utility that, yes, of course, we need to build. So it was in this context that Councillor Tim Tierney was lobbied by Enbridge, and Cafés was able to find that out and prove it by looking at the lobby register. And we also have strong reason to believe that he was lobbied by Jane Wilson from Ottawa Wind Concerns, who is fiercely against renewable energies, especially wind, and in favor of nuclear and gas. So Tierney gives this motion in October that tried to say, oh, the city of Ottawa should retract its former submission to the OEB, and we should have the staff or force the staff to support this capital project for the replacement of the pipeline. Now, this is kind of like a little bit crazy, right? Like, when do you tell professionals on the city staff that they should like take back a submission to like a quasi judicial body, like after a ruling has been made? Very bizarre as recommendations go. And then also in terms of taking position on a new application by Enbridge before it's even been made, before there's even any kind of new evidence arguing for the need of this capital project, which is an over $100 million capital project. So very, very dubious that this councillor should be so gullible that he should take this so fully on board and walk it to council. And then on top of that, he seems to be quite misinformed, because the if you want to follow the money on this pipeline issue, it's if it's a capital project where we've replaced the whole pipeline, then the ratepayers are going to be paying for this in our rates. And if it's a matter of just doing better maintenance, then that's supposed to be in the current financial envelope that the utility has been granted. So from an affordability and pocketbook perspective, the two solutions are also quite different, which is not what Tierney was saying in public. So the Café's position on this, of course, is that no, we should not be spending millions of dollars on investing in renewing our fossil fuel infrastructure at this point when we are set to make an energy transition. This issue is going to be with Ottawa. I think that the Enbridge is going to resubmit the application, and we'll see how it comes out. The outcome at City Council was that saner minds prevailed, and there was some pressure put on Councillor Tierney. So he amended his motion quite dramatically until it was like something that was quite innocuous and was definitely not directing staff to be doing things that kind of interfered with their seeming professional judgment. So they're allowed to stay with their professional judgment. So that was that story. And we'll see when it comes up again. But who knew that we had such a big pipeline issue right here in Ottawa? The next dramatic vignette that I would like to share with you is what's happening in the energy transition. So it turns out that the electricity grid, the Ontario grid, is very soon going to be needing new supply and new capacity. There's a whole bunch of factors, including increasing demand. Some of our nuclear fleet is going down because of maintenance. Some of it is being retired. So the IESO, which is the Independent Electricity Systems Operator, puts out these calls for proposals. So then different private sector entities can say, oh yes, I will supply this power, I will build this plant. So what's very interesting, if you remember that when Doug Ford came into power, he was dead set against renewable energy to the point of actually dismantling some wind energy turbines that had been virtually already completed. He canceled a lot of contracts. But the situation has changed. The energy needs of the grid are very different, and also on a cost basis. Not only the wind and solar have come down in price, but also battery technology has massively increased and gone down in price, so that we can now have utility scale batteries, like huge batteries that can absorb the intermittent power from renewable and store it, so that we can then use the stored power, especially at the peak load time. So that there's, in a sense, a competition between, should we be using these utility scale battery systems called BESS, battery energy storage system, BESS, or should we be building these gas peaker plants, right? Which Doug Ford has also given the thumbs up to. So in a sense, these technologies compete against each other. So in response to one of these one more thing I want to tell you. So the rules of the game is that the ISO calls for the proposals, then the proponents come up with, okay, we'll build this here. But then there's a requirement for a thing called a municipal support resolution. So in order to give more voice to local host locations, that is a requirement. And if you get your municipal support resolution just before you get your proposal in, then you actually get a few extra points in the bidding process, a significant amount. Or if you get the contract, you still later, you have to get that support resolution. So that gives quite a lot of power, and then leads to all kinds of drama locally, it turns out. So in the most recent call, there was a bid closing on the 12th of December. And the systems in play were these BESS systems. And there was 5 proponents that were interested in locations near transmission wires in the Ottawa area. One of them got so discouraged by Councillor Darouze and a local consultation that they just withdrew. Then there was 4 remaining proponents. They also had requirements for a local meeting. And then it went to the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee on November 30th. 3 of them were rejected, and 1 of them was approved. And then it went, and that was unanimous by the ARAC committee. So the rural councillors are serving as gatekeepers for these new technologies supporting our grid in clean tech, clean, non-emitting ways. And they turned most of these proposals down, but did approve 1, and in their recommendation said, no, this is not NIMBY. We're not against new technology. It's just that there's too many unanswered questions. And the Ottawa Council then just said, yep, okay, fine. No debate, no interference. So the interesting thing is that there are voices for and against, especially in the rural area, in terms of do we even believe climate change is happening? Do we want an energy transition? Are we ready to start shifting to solar, ground mount, larger installations, industrial wind turbines, and these battery systems? Or are we saying like, no, we don't want change. We're not willing to make the energy transition. So this is, I would say the fossil fuel crisis and the transition or not transition is very much playing out right in front of our eyes. And there was a number of local consultation meetings that was, for me, a very interesting experience. I don't know how many of you have actually like been in a room where the crowd has sort of like a palpable energy that is like hostile towards something. And there was 2 consultation meetings like that where they were, the call out was made by proponents that are against renewable energy, including the anti-wind people and the landowner people. There's like an Ottawa, Ontario Landowner Association, very, very dubious about climate and climate action. They mobilized people. There were messages that were very filled with fear about the potential for fire, the potential for pollution of the groundwater, like really exaggerating technologies that are proven, that are working in especially the states that have safety standards that are very precise, that need to be met. So really exaggerating. And so we had a couple of these meetings where through fear-mongering, crowds had been mobilized that were really very, very hostile. Ottawa is not alone in seeing that. There was another one near Brockville where somebody in the crowd like uttered like a death threat to like saying somebody's going to die over this. And the proponents, they just walked away from this. So obviously there's a lot more work needed in terms of public education, in terms of you can't just roll into town with a new technology and expect people to go like, hallelujah. So I'm not necessarily just saying, oh, the rural population is not smart. I'm saying that the process of consultation was not very good, and the level of public education and discussion needs to be really raised. And cafes definitely sees a role in that for us. And I would argue that this is also the business of everybody in Ottawa, not just the people in Fitzroy Harbor. So while, of course, the immediate local neighbors are impacted, I think it's everybody's business, and it's not necessarily appropriate for, a couple of angry voices from Arnprior to then be setting the tone. But that challenge for those of us who do want to see the energy transition, and Aaron, I noticed you telling us that you had your heat pump purring away in your house in Greeley. So obviously, I think in this group there is support and energy for the energy transition. So I think that part of that challenge is going to be for us to mobilize, to welcome some of these renewable energy installations and projects that need these municipal support resolutions here in Ottawa. And Ottawa is also to decide new planning and zoning rules for renewable energy facilities, and that's supposed to be happening in the first quarter of the next coming year in 2024. So again, I think that we need to come out and say that we welcome the energy transition. So that was really dramatic. Now the next thing I'm going to talk a little bit. This is my fourth climate update topic, is what's been happening with the urban canopy. So our mayor, Mark Sutcliffe, he came in with an election promise saying, we are going to plant 1 million trees in my first term of council. Which is pretty much a doubling of what Watson was doing. And so far, that promise has been like idle. The place that I mean, there hasn't been announcements. And also when I check the budget, like we're not seeing like more money for trees. So in terms of climate risk, heat and the heat waves, prolonged heat waves, are probably one of the most potentially fatal, pernicious, high-cost effects. So shade from canopy trees to combat the urban heat island is actually quite critical. And we need to plant not just little shrubby things, but we need to make a really mindful effort that we need to be planting canopy trees. And there's very little discussion in Ottawa in terms of what species of trees, when there are plans for city to be planting trees. Are we actually planting species that will grow tall, and are we actually giving enough soil volume for that growth to happen? I think that's a really important thing to bring forward systematically. In terms of climate risk, we're also expecting more sudden intense rainfalls, which then will cause the overland flooding when the capacity of our stormwater management is exceeded. So another recommendation that Cafés has for the infrastructure master plan is that there is a need to integrate the planning for street trees and stormwater management, that we like put both hats on when we think about the permeable spaces that can be used for both these purposes. And the city of Ottawa is not doing any of that. These things are very, very separate stovepipes in terms of planning and responsibility. So that's something that Cafés is pushing on and advocating. The last point on urban canopy that we've been thinking about is that certainly increasing urban density is good climate planning, right? It's the opposite of sprawl. We live in compactor ways. We have less need to drive. But infill can definitely also serve to squeeze out all the trees. So if as we redevelop buildings have a much larger footprint, that means the trees fall. So as Ottawa in the next couple of years finalizes our new zoning bylaw, right, that falls out of the new official plan, we think it's very important that we take this change of regime in terms of zoning bylaw and say we need to have some metrics that actually leave enough space for the needs, like the biological needs of large canopy trees. If we're saying we want these trees, then we need to get real and figure out how many cubic meters of soil and how are we going to organize for the drainage and the piping for these city trees. And right now that those agendas are not meeting in that concrete metrics kind of a way, so that we fear that the developers are going to sort of push to the last inch of the property, and then there will not be any trees. And then I suppose like if 20 years later somebody says, hey, we'd really like to have some trees, it'll be like super expensive to start like diverting and cutting new space out of other plans. So we think that it's an extremely important moment as we're talking about the new zoning bylaw. So that concludes my 4 areas of climate municipal briefing. What's new? One look back. Earlier this year, Cafés co-hosted 10 workshops with local community associations to talk with people about what their concerns are in terms of climate risks, what are people fearing, and then also what are some of the solutions they see, what would they like to see their neighborhoods as community solutions, what would they like the city do. And there is a final report that pulls together the community voices of all these 10 workshops, and then there was a virtual one. And you can find that report on our website under the project tab. And the city of Ottawa, like, who has received this report, this community report as an input, they're supposed to be releasing the draft city climate risk strategy in early 2024. So that's another thing to also keep an eye out for. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation. So as an ending note, I would like to invite all of you. You're very welcome to become individual members. Your organization also can, if you wish, can become an organizational member. We do have 2 other faith-based organization members, the Unitarians, and that you can access that on our website. If you want contacts in terms of if you have project ideas or queries or whatever, I've also provided you with the emails for myself and Jacqueline, who is the current climate coordinator at Cafés. So that's it. And I now welcome your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Angela. That was a great presentation, very interesting and very eye-opening for us to understand what has been recently happening in the Ottawa area around climate. Friends, feel free to raise your hand either virtually or just on the screen. I see Gary, you'd like to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Angela a question. How many neighborhoods did you say there were in Ottawa?
Neighborhoods. I think there's somewhere between 150 to 200 community associations, but like some of them are just a couple of little blocks that are saying, hey, we're the, I don't know, Dow's Lake Community Association, right? And then other ones are much larger. So for example, like the Alta Vista Community Association covers quite a lot of ground. And the rural ones, obviously, in terms of square kilometers, they cover a lot.
Yeah, you said you had 10 community workshops. It occurred to me that if there was any possibility of, in more of the neighborhoods, some of them may be combined into, groups of neighborhoods if they're too small, but actually setting up task forces of community members for education and advocacy, where they act more or less, they get together, discuss perspectives from their own community, and take action independently of the larger cafes in those communities. Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah. That's something that Cafés very much kind of cultivates and foments in terms of like our plans for the future. We would like every not just the residents and community associations, but pretty much any civic type organization, we would encourage them to have an environment committee and to think about and I mean there's many different ways, right, to think about our natural environment, the ecological balances, also just starting with how we eat, right? That is part of those equations. So there's lots of work to be done, and but lots of community building too. So there's some community associations that have like formal environment committees. Other ones have like a board member, maybe that's the point person for environment. And it would be really nice to help build that social community infrastructure. I totally agree with you, Gary. So Sherry, are you gonna facilitate and call on people, or?
Either way, Angela, I see Stephen has his hand up, and then Bill.
Okay.
Hi, Angela. In Centertown, we're working quite a bit on the urban forest front, and some other areas, parks and gardens and so on. At the ground level. And the challenges are some of the ones you mentioned. You know, new buildings have huge footprints. Infill just removes everything. We have very few green spaces to start out with, very limited parks. And so we're looking for options of, you know, developing things like mini parks and parkettes and so on. And we're surveying trees, urban trees. But a big problem there is that our stock of urban trees is old.
Mhm.
And there's no replacement plan in the city for that. In fact, there's very little plan to plant any trees downtown. Even, you know, out of that million of trees, they're not being allocated to downtown. So anyways, we're looking for ways to try and put together information where we can work with the city as best as we can to try and change some of the views and attitudes and so on.
For sure. And it's I mean, you know that expression, death by 1,000 cuts. Like sometimes it seems like, oh well, you know, it's understandable that this tree has to go for this corner, that corner development. But if you keep doing that, and as you said, if you have aging trees that don't get replaced, then pretty soon there's going to be like very few trees left, right? So I think sometimes like the battle and grandstanding for just like even one tree that people love is a cultural thing that I think we should support. And I think the city, quite honestly, I mean, I deal with different city departments in terms of our conversations and our letters and our advocacy, and the forestry people are not the most responsive. So what has been happening is that people end up going through their counselor, right? So if you can't reach city staff and get intelligible, sensible human answers, then you work it through the political angle. A lot of times inquiries to the counselor or complaints, right, where trees are being cut without permits, the counselor's offices then immediately push it to staff, and staff then pretty much have to answer, right, if the inquiry is coming from the political level. So I would very much encourage you to continue doing that. I know that Darlene in Centertown has been doing a pretty awesome job of organizing, and this whole idea of the community identifying plantable spaces, right? Where is there room on rights of way, on other kinds of public spaces? I think that's also very, very worthwhile as these spaces are becoming fewer and more constrained. So thank you for your work in this area, Stephen.
Welcome.
Thank you, Bill.
So,
And after him, Eric.
okay. So you asked in the beginning to give you some feedback on how much of what you presented that we know about. And, you know, I consider myself pretty knowledgeable about stuff going on. I knew very little of this. So point being is that I think what you're presenting in this kind of presentation has great value in terms of keeping people who are out there trying to be effective and knowledgeable on their toes and able to perform better in terms of what we're trying to all accomplish. And I think that brings me to part one of my question, which is, are you bringing these kind of presentations to service organizations? And I'm thinking about Rotary, which has, you know, regional and urban and rural areas, and they have just begun to become engaged in environmental issues. So, and if you haven't invaded this venue, then if you need any assistance in doing so, Sherry and/or I can help with that. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that you talked about that you were actively pursuing agency in rural areas as well as urban areas, and I was wondering the degree to which you're actively building bridges between the two in terms of the concerns and perceptions of people in the urban areas is completely different than that of rural areas, and that if it seems that if people understood where the other were coming from and was more tuned in to the realities of the one that they were not, whether that's rural or urban, that there would be a little bit more easier to gain some consensus and move toward reasonable actions that are useful.
I would really love it, like if our trend, like right now what we have is we have rural members, both organizational and individual, but they're still kind of like scarce, right? So it would be great if the numbers start like really balancing out, and there can be conversations, say like in our tree caucus or in our climate caucus, saying like hey, let's talk about like wetlands in rural areas and what can we do to protect those, and then like some of the rural landowners are like, well, like we don't need a bunch of like government and urbanites to tell us like what we should be or should not be doing with our land, right? And it's kind of the, you know, if the kids don't want to take over the farm, then like, yeah, we just wait for the land to appreciate, and that's basically our retirement plan, to sell that land for future development. And like some of these perspectives is like, it's pretty hard to argue with that. Like you can't sort of say like, no, like that's wrong. But some of it does also break down to like philosophical kind of differences, right? Which doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to have the conversations and understand each other better. So to some degree, if cafes in our network, if our membership does start to balance out more, we can also expect to have more policy disagreements. And we'll have to deal with that like as it comes up. In terms of your question of whether we're doing a good job of reaching out to service clubs, absolutely not. We're not. I consider sort of the first quarter of the year as our membership drive month. So it's a really good time for me to think about that. How do we do that kind of outreach? What kind of value, right, can our network provide to organizations? But like I know Cafes was at the Eco Fair that you folks organized in the summer, and there was a Rotary Club that was also tabling information. And I know that there's a Rotary guy in Orleans somewhere that's like the uncle of somebody who is part of the Forêt Capitale Forest. So there are, you know, networks of individual people, but if you have ideas or suggestions for how cafes could approach service clubs, like more generally, that would be very useful and very welcome. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Hi there. My name's Eric, and I'm just have a question. Like Sean Menard is the chairman of the environmental.
Yeah.
Of the environment. I was wondering, you haven't mentioned his name at all. Have you communicated with him at all?
Yes, actually, I live in Sean's ward. And Sean is very, I mean, I have very good communications with Sean. If I have a bee in my bonnet, he answers pretty quickly. And I mean, like the Lansdowne thing, I think took up a huge amount of oxygen. So I wasn't expecting that much environmental action from him during that time. And it's a little bit difficult for him too, in the sense that the votes on his environment and climate committee are pretty split. But in a sense, that means that we need each other more, right? So that if from the community side, we can have people visiting their counselors and saying like, you know, hey, Marty Carr, like we need this. And so Marty is like one of these people that could be a bit of a swing voter on that committee, right? So having her constituents and her residents come to her and say, hey, we care about this, whatever the issue is, that those things matter, right? Especially when you do get these swing tippy committees where it's not to be taken for granted what the outcome is of this and that vote.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, you have a question?
Yes, my question is about batteries, and I'm wondering, Ottawa is pretty lucky, I think, in that it has a municipal utility, Hydro Ottawa. And so I'm wondering whether Hydro Ottawa and whether you have efforts to encourage Hydro Ottawa to incorporate more batteries into what they do, whether those are batteries that people own in their electric vehicles, or whether they're microgrid-based batteries that can provide backups to whole neighborhoods or to buildings to serve as like emergency shelters in the event that the power goes out, or whether they're like school buses that are electric buses that can be used to balance the grid. So I'm thinking maybe there's an opportunity there because Ottawa owns its own electric utility.
So I think, Aaron, you've mentioned not only like one solution, but like a whole bunch of solutions right there, right? In what you were saying. So I think exploring how we can use microgrids to start having that resiliency is something that's just coming into sight. I think the technology is there, but it's still sort of at the early adopter. Can we put these systems together? Hydro, Ottawa Hydro, it's a thing. I think that they're still kind of recovering from the strike, in terms of having that much nimbleness. They're kind of playing catch up is the sense I had in a couple of like conversations with people I just came across. The relationships between the city of Ottawa, that nominally is the sole shareholder in Hydro Ottawa, like between Hydro and the city, like you're not always sure like who's the dog and who's the tail here. I like, just from a logical point of view, like I would think that the city has a lot of authority and power over what hydro is doing that is kind of not exercised. There's 2 city councilors that sit on the board of hydro, and then hydro comes to its sole shareholder once a year and reports. But I think that more could be done. And I have been meaning to take a look at the strategic plan of Ottawa Hydro, to what degree that addresses the climate challenge. I think it's mentioned, but I'm not really aware of Hydro Ottawa being the sort of first to innovate. Now that might change a little bit as the provincial grid, like the ISO, is like launching these calls. Hydro Ottawa also has a wholly owned subsidiary that does renewable energy generation, right? So there is knowledge, there is technology, there's staff. But I think that you're like totally right that these are the kind of frontiers that we should be pushing on and raising expectations. And and when there's like stupid barriers that, oh, you can't install this because like it, and like there's a sudden fee of like $2,000 to have like some minor upgrade to enable homeowners to be more energy resilient, like these kind of little barriers to action. That's some of the practical systems change thing that I think we need to push against, so that it becomes possible for residents in the city of Ottawa to have these lighter carbon footprints. If people have the will and the resources, there shouldn't be these regulatory barriers put up by our utility, but the utility should be trying to help people to have battery and resilience systems, and not make everybody go to the hardware store to buy the diesel generator to have a backup. And I understand that, especially as you go out and people are further out of the city, they feel that they do need their own home backup power system. But if like every single like multi-unit residential building in town starts saying that would be a massive step backwards, and like a reinvestment in fossil fuel infrastructure. So I worry about that quite a lot. But I'm not sure yet whether we have like the economics would work for larger buildings to start investing in large batteries to start being backups for elevators and freezers. And but we're headed in that direction to make that feasible, but we're not there yet. I hope
Thank
I've
you.
answered enough of your question, but I really like how you're thinking.
Thanks.
Okay, I want to read something that Ned put in the chat, and then go to Heather, who has her hand up. Ned says, "Hi, I have joined you from Tavistock, south of Stratford at the center of the Huron Tract, a very productive area of industrial agriculture. There is some enthusiasm for tree planting. Janet and I are members of Let's Tree Wilmot. To involve farmers in tree planting and tree preservation, it may be best to work first with organic farmers. No getting away from slow growth of trees here. We worked in Uganda in 2021 where trees grow very fast." Angela, do you have any comments about Ned's observation of working maybe with organic farmers and tree planting?
There's a couple, I guess, in terms of like rural and farmer tree planting. I know that there is a group called, I think, Ottawa something Woodlands, and they are trying to figure out the tax incentives for preserving woodlands versus using land just as agricultural land. And because to the extent that we are losing woodlots, maybe if the tax incentives were more balanced, so that it's not just in favor of agriculture, but also in favor of treed lands, then that would help. So that is an initiative that those guys are undertaking. In a recent meeting also of the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, though, the city was trying to make some changes to its site alteration bylaw. And basically the Rural and Agricultural Affairs Committee just sort of said, no, we don't want you guys putting any restrictions to preserve land from. The issue was sort of preemptive clearing, like where there's no development permit yet, but people want to basically not have any like nature environmental restrictions in the way for future selling the land for development, so that they would just clear the land, drain the swamp, and be ready, and that should be kind of not allowed, right? But that was what the bylaw was trying to do, but then the Rural Affairs Committee said, like, nope, don't tell people what to do. So in terms of protecting woodlands and trees, it's very difficult in terms of our legal setup. The one thing that I find also interesting is discussions to what degree we can have solar energy installations coexisting with agricultural land use. So apparently there are some crops that do need also shade, that don't benefit from having a full day of sunlight, so that you can interplant these crops with ground-mounted solar panels. And obviously traveling around in Europe, it's very common to be seeing large windmills in farmers' fields. So in terms of there being like big tensions between the agricultural associations and renewable energy, I'd like to learn more about like who's saying what and why in Canada. So I know that's not really relating to trees, which was your angle, but that's something I'm interested in.
Thank you, Angela, for your response. Heather, this will be the last question.
Mine is really more of a comment.
All right.
And I mean, what we're all looking for is a livable city. And what is good about your presentation tonight is you reminded us that for this to happen, we have to look at governance, and we have to look at policy, and we have to look at the interrelation of different policies. And we have to be forward thinking, and we also need a really strong knowledge base and people talking to each other. So I think a presentation like this is really important because, you know, there's people who are tree people and there's people who are interested in solar, and it's all part of the same, you know, it's one world, right? And we're all trying to find different ways to work towards this world. So this was a really interesting presentation to me for that. Thank you.
Wow, I'm glad you found it interesting. I mean, I know that like I find that the work that we do interesting, and like sometimes you can get sort of a little bit too nerdy, and go into more and more details. But like some of these like dramas, like around this pipeline and the battery meetings, like it's that there's stuff happening, and certainly the media does not cover it very much at all. Right? They I don't actually totally understand like how they pick stories, because a lot of stuff that I'm interested in seems to get like no coverage at all. So I'm glad that you found the presentation interesting, Heather.
Linda, Angela, I want to thank you for your presentation this evening. It was really interesting to hear what's going on, and also just heartening to know that, you know, there's an organization like yours out there that's, you know, attending these meetings in the city and working with the city to make recommendations and you know, to hold people accountable for achieving the master plan, you know, and giving air to what's going on, and, you know, asking those tough questions, and organizing, you know, groups of like-minded people around a more sustainable city. So I think we all want to give you a round of applause and say,
Thank you.
keep at it. And we're actually going to close with another song from Psy. But before we do that, I'd like to announce our upcoming meeting in January. It's going to be on Tuesday, January 30th at 7:30. John Crump, who is a senior policy officer with the Inuit Circumpolar Council, has recently participated in the climate change conference talks, and he will be doing a presentation about progress and outcomes of the recently concluded 28th COP, Conference of the Parties. And for music, local artist Joel Tamas, guitarist, singer, and songwriter with the band Red Heaven, will be performing. So I hope that you all can join us for that Environmental Cafe 613 in January. Sai, if you'd like to play another song, we'll leave on a really high note.
Okay, I'll continue with the theme of love. And any of you guitar players out there, Stephen, for this, you put your capo upside down actually on the 2nd fret and leave the E string open. It's nice, especially for this song. This is Beatles, Norwegian Wood. It is a love song, but not, there's a bit of hidden meanings in the words. I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. She showed me her room. Isn't it good? Norwegian Wood. She asked me to stay. She told me to sit anywhere. So I looked around and I noticed there wasn't a chair. I sat on the rug, biding my time, drinking her wine. We talked until 2, and then she said, it's time for bed. She told me she worked in the morning and started to laugh. I told her I didn't, and crawled off to sleep in the bath. And when I awoke, this was alone, desperate as well. So I lit the fire, isn't it good? Norwegian Wood.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cy. That was beautiful.
Thank
Great,
you.
thanks, Cy.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation, by the way. I didn't know any of that information that you brought up, Angela. One thing I want to throw in though is it was just announced that they're eliminating all the gas combustion engines by 2035. The government announced just the other day.
2035.
Yeah, 2035. So
Mhm.
yeah, no more gas engines for cars. So hopefully I'm still around by then.
Progress is coming. It may seem very slow to us, given the amount of carbon that's in the air and that we're putting more out there all the time and how it's affecting us. But we are seeing progress. So we maintain hope and do what actions that we can. And that's all we can do. So wishing everyone happy holidays, be safe, be healthy, and see you all in January. And thanks again very much to Angela and to Cy and to all of you for joining.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Ashley.
Bye, bye.
Bye.
Have a good
Bye.
night, everyone.